two questions we have here. The first one is, why is the church suffering from the same troubles that the world is suffering? These are things that we really need to take to mind and keep them in mind as we go through this. If we keep these questions in mind as we go through this, we start realizing the connections that we have here. The other question is, why is it becoming more difficult to distinguish in many areas Christians from non-Christians in this modern culture? Those are things that we're going to be looking at as we go. I've got here what's called What Americans Believe by George Barna, and this is a 1990 a poll that was taken, and it talks about the relevance of Christianity in lives today. It has a very small percentage of people who believe that there is relevance to life. Back in 1990, only 24% of the people in the United States believed that there was any actual relevance to life, which tells us something very interesting. People from the ages 18 to 25, only 35% believed that life has relevance. Then among the Christian adults, only 47% believed that life had any relevance. Christian adults. And in 10 years, these percentages have diminished. They've dropped. And that tells us something that's very important, very, very significant to us. The same thing, back then the question was, the statement is, there is no such thing as an absolute truth. Only, you had 28% people that believed there were absolutes in the church, and 16% of the young adults believed there were absolutes in the church. That's back in 1990. We're far beyond the year 1990. I have here something that I would like to show you. I found a painting by Edvard Munch. He was a Norwegian, lived the years 1863 to 1944. So he saw a lot of transition in France, in Germany, and Russia as well. He lived through these lands as his life went on. He painted some pictures, and I went ahead and made my own copy of one of his famous paintings, which is called The Scream. And it's an interesting painting, The Scream. It's a scream that's silent. It represents the inner turmoil of a person who's suffering from despair and loneliness in a society that has gone completely awry and chaotic. So this painting is actually even relevant today for us, because I think we're about this at this point as a society ourselves. This is the external description of the internal turmoil that is occurring in most of our youth today. This is how they feel today. We live in a time when you have your teenagers going off to college, and they get there and they go in with the things they've been taught about God, and as they get through school, they start seeing this is a different atmosphere. This is a completely foreign milieu that they walk into, and they start asking, can I really believe the Bible in this place? I mean, this is reality, you know. The Bible is something else, and it's only in church where I hear about the Bible. And so they start having this clash of worldviews in their own minds, and they're starting to doubt and think. What I have put here on the board is the worldview that we've had for almost 2,000 years. The circles represent certain things. I put here the first circle represents God, The second circle represents creation. And as we see this, we also see that when you speak of God, you're speaking of the sacred. And here you're speaking of the secular. And we have here creation as a theological concept, if we may say that, is dependent upon God. There is always that connection between God and creation. The worldview that we had is a three-story world where we had, or a three-story universe where we had heaven, we had earth, and we had, of course, hell. So we believed this for the longest time. But then, as history went on, the great thinkers and philosophers began to doubt the structure, began to reason about the structure. So many things happened through history that we had to develop what was called a dialectic. A dialectic simply means that you can pose two contrary concepts and then you have to build a compromise from the two. In other words, they have the thesis versus antithesis equals synthesis. But in the process of as we did that, what happened is we disconnected the secular from the sacred. We disconnected God from His creation. God used to be transcendent. God used to be far superior to His creation, yet He was involved in creation. God used to be eminent. He was far greater than any creature or being that other than God, and He was present in everything in the sense of providence. But as men begin to reason, they started saying, well, if there is a God, He's no longer concerned about His creation. If there is a sacred, the sacred no longer has any meaning in the secular. And from there came the concept of humanism and then the secular worldview that we have with no reference to God whatsoever. And heaven, earth, and hell became a completely disconnected imaginary concept, no longer a reality. And it's important that we understand that. I want us to open our Bibles to the book of Psalms this evening. Let's look there in the book of Psalms, and we're going to begin by focusing on chapter 2 of the book of Psalms. In Psalms chapter 2, we have a very relative statement here as to what the conditions of the human race are and what a human propensity is when mankind feels himself self-sufficient. The first thing mankind tries to do when it feels self-sufficient is to disconnect God from His world, from His world view. Let's read this. Psalms chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, Let us break their bonds asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall He speak unto them in His wrath and vex them in His sore displeasure." Here you have the attitude of the world that decides that it does not need God, that it does not want God. It has a worldview which has no room for God in it. I have something that I'd like to relate to you. It's a historical record, but it's in a way of a story, and I'm going to read some of it to you because I want you to hear it in the precise way that it's related. In the year 1889, in the Transcaucasian village of Gori, there lived a young boy named Yosef Vissarionich Jugasvili. Yosef greatly feared his abusive father, who often beat small Yosef and his mother. Even his normally kind, gentle mother, Ekaterina, would occasionally take out her frustrations on Yosef. The home situation so deteriorated and was so desperate that young Yosef was shipped to a seminary, since seminaries were the equivalent of public schools today, and specifically provided for the poor. He was sent there to study in Tiflis. The other boys bullied him due to his small stature, but he demonstrated an unyielding will by which he earned their admiration. During schoolyard games, he would ride on the other boy's back, and with his fists waving up in the air, he would shout, "Yastal! Yastal!" which means, "I am Steve." And while at seminary, he read a novel about blood and thunder heroes conquering their enemies, and he enjoyed it so much he adopted one of the primary warriors' names as his own, Koba. His favorite novel was called The Patricide, or that is, one who kills his father. Yosef, or Koba, accidentally came across a verse of literature printed by the social revolutionaries. The pamphlet attacked the Orthodox Church and its doctrines and promulgated Darwin's theory of evolution. He abandoned his faith in God, and he began to believe these ideas by what he read. He also quit the seminary before graduating, and when he got home, he found his mother had another man, since his stepfather had already died, and at this point his heart hardened with hatred for God. He became steel. He joined the socialist revolution and clawed his way to power. He redubbed himself by the name Joseph Stalin, or Joseph Stalin as we know. And notice the root name Stalin. He became uncontested dictator and head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. He consolidated the communist empire and called it the USSR. His infamy is one of reign of terror. The worldview he acquired from his brutal childhood, reinforced by Darwinian doctrine, convinced him that mercy and forbearance were weak and worthless commodities. He killed with treachery and steel coldness. He did 5 things. 1, he exterminated the priesthood. He burned the churches and imprisoned believers. 2, he executed the intellectuals and diplomats, including his own comrades, on trifling pretexts. 3, he extinguished the noblest people of the land. 4, disagreement or suspicion meant certain death. And number 5, by the time Stalin ended his reign of terror, he had exterminated over 16 million people. In a private interview, Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, related the story that when her father was on his deathbed, the thing that she could not extract from her mind was that several times during his sleep, he would suddenly wake up and just seem to be warding off some invisible forces. And then he'd stop and look up to the sky and wave his fists and lay back down. He did this several times, and he did it one last time before he died. It was as though Joseph Stalin was raising his angry fist at God and screaming, "Ya Stalin! Ya Stalin!" Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was imprisoned under the communist regime, wrote that when he was a boy during the revolution, incredible atrocities were being committed. This historian recalls to this day that when his grandparents and his parents got together, the repeated discussions always ended up with the question, "Why is this happening to us?" And the resounding answer was always the same: it is because we have forgotten God. And so we see here that such is the consequence of a worldview which has no area for a divine category. It is void of spirituality and spiritual principles. It holds no criteria for an ultimate frame of reference for determining truth. The historian asks, what The sociologist asks how, and the psychologist asks why. But the rise of the autonomous, baseless worldview of secular humanism provides no answer. And if the possibility of God's existence is even suggested or insinuated, the iron fist goes up, and modern man says, "Ya está, ya está." History is fraught with vast complexities, and yet one uniform lesson is absolute. Any nation that proceeds from a worldview exempt of God and His law always collapses and dies. Will Durant, the eminent historian, stated once that civilizations lie in the dust as a testament that nothing can endure without morality and religion. No physical or social science can answer the questions that are so vital to life. There is no set of philosophical terms which exclude the concept of God that can ever provide an adequate, satisfactory answer to the ultimate questions, inextricably inherent in every human soul. Number one, who am I? The search for identity. Number two, what am I? The search for meaning. Number three, why am I here? The search for purpose. Number four, where did I come from? The search for origin. And number five, where am I going? In search for destiny. You see, no philosophy that excludes the concept of God can answer these questions. And if they do, never satisfactorily. History demonstrates. Will Durant also said the greatest question of our time is not communism versus the individual. It's not Europe versus America. It is not even the East versus the West. It is whether man can live without God. That's the question. The premise of our study as we go through our theme is that man cannot live by a worldview without God. It ultimately collides with reality and ends in disaster and ultimate damnation. Psalms 9:17 says, the wicked will be turned into hell, and all those nations that forget God. And it's never been proven false yet. As we go through these things, we have to keep in mind that what we're looking at is a process that has taken place. If you go further with me in Psalms chapter 11 and read a passage there with me, it says this in verse 3. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? You see, the foundations have everything to do with a definite point of reference in life. As we go through the history of the world, we see that worldviews develop. We see the rise of worldviews, and we see in the ancient cultures that worldviews were products of early man's quest for truth and meaning. You had ancient Greece, whose worldview was wrapped up around mythology. You had ancient Rome, who also was wrapped up around mythology. You had Mesopotamia, and they were wrapped around polytheism, and that was even the Canaanite type of mentality. Their worldview was a worldview that was held together by war gods. The war gods. They had their gods, and these gods were basically gods of war. And that is the area where the Jehovah God demonstrated who is God. Egypt had its mysticism and mythology. Canaan had its polytheism, also, as we say, war gods. And India was engulfed in Hinduism and polytheism. And China had Buddhism, which is a form of pantheism, but actually atheism, because it really worshiped no God. So basically, these are the worldviews that you find developing through history. And as you go through history, as these civilizations become more integral and interrelated, you get a mixture of these philosophies that develop into other types of worldview. But we'll begin where we're supposed to begin, where the most sophisticated type of worldviews came into existence, and that is in Greece. Classical worldview in Greece, it sought to set down the foundational truths. It sought the first principles or basic truths. There was ancient philosophy, and ancient philosophy always quested for basically, first of all, what we call monarchy, second, unity and diversity, and third, cosmos. What do we mean with this? We mean that when we speak of monarchy, we're speaking of what's called the single supreme essence or substance or ultimate reality. And when we speak of unity and diversity or the universe, we're talking about coherence. Coherence. Coherence means you're going to take everything that you put together, described, defined, and illustrated, and you need it to come together in such a way that it forms something with a consistent meaning to it. And that's what philosophy thought in the area of diversity. And in cosmos, it thought it could find cosmos over chaos, order over confusion. And this was the long quest of historical development through the ages. And that's what they were looking for. The ancient pre-Socratic philosophy sought to answer these questions. They asked, is ultimate reality physical or is it non-physical? Is ultimate reality one or more than one? The discussion pertained to physics and dimensions. It pertained to form and essence, which is substance or being, which we call ontology. And the other one was cosmology, the order of the universe, and the other one was teleology, the purpose in the universe. These are simple questions, yet they're complex when you want to find a coherent answer for these, what they mean in life. How does that apply to life? Here began the worldviews consisting of monistic versus pluralistic categories. Monistic versus pluralistic categories. Is it one answer or is it a set of answers? That's very important, because when you come down into the 21st century, you find these same things taking process today. You've heard of pluralism, right? Yes, we have. Where the individual has been lost in corporate pluralism. But basically it began with the concept that monism was corporeal, and some held that there's four categories. Some held that monism was corporeal monism, or that is ultimate reality is physical and one. And then it was the corporeal pluralism, which said ultimate reality is physical and more than one. And then you had the incorporeal monism that said ultimate reality is non-physical and one, and the incorporeal pluralism, ultimate reality is non-physical and more than one. On these premises began the battle of definitions for a tolerable, if not adequate, worldview. You had philosophers like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Xenophanes, Heraclitus, Democritus, who they called the laughing philosopher because they considered him a madman where he was at. And you had Pythagoras, the master mathematician, who assigned mystical significance to numbers. You had Parmenides that said whatever is, is. That led to the concept of empiricism in the 18th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. But you have these same types of thinking, and you've also found Zeno, Empedocles, and Anaxagoras, who said the universe is composed of seeds, which later developed into the concept of atoms. Then you had Socrates, who they called the gadfly, because he was always out testing everyone's ideas of things, and he'd always say, "How do you know?" You know, "How are you sure about that?" You know, he's like the gadfly. And he's the one that said, "An unexamined life is not worth living." That's interesting. Plato founded the academy with the theory of ideas, types, and archetypes, and the ideal. And everything moves toward an ideal because the ideal created it. That's kind of abstract, but that's where that started. And Aristotle taught Alexander of Macedon. He tutored him. He started the peripatetic schools where they would walk around discussing issues. He taught always walking around. He wrote several writings on ideology, on biology, he constructed a system of logic, of categories. He wrote on politics, on ethics and poetics and metaphysics and ethics. Aristotle defined 4 causes that to this day are with us, which was first of all the material cause, which is the substance of a thing. A thing exists because it has substance, and that is the material cause of it. He described the formal cause, the shape or the configuration of a thing, and then the efficient cause or the change agent, or the thing that brings about the activity or the shape of the thing, and the final cause, the purpose, the goal or completion of a thing. He also developed in logic what's called the laws of thought, which are 4 as well. The law of identity, which says a thing is what it is. The law of contradiction, which says a thing cannot be and not be. And the excluded middle that says of all possible considerations, only one thing is what it is. And the sufficient reason, which says a thing is what it is because it can be no other after being tested. An example of it was the system of syllogism that says, for example, all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Simple logic, as they called it. So you have these early developments of thought, of thinking patterns and mechanisms by which to develop concepts of reality and produce worldviews of things. And the pagan worldview, the system developed by great philosophers, was pagan, and we have to remember this. When we go to these philosophers, these are pagan worldviews, and they are derived worldviews. They are reaching out into the physical universe. They are reaching out into the areas of abstract mathematics and trying to develop some kind of concept and get some kind of coherence of what it's all about. But this is derived. The worldview of the ancient world was all derived, therefore subject to error and change. I'm saying this because when you go to the modern universities, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle are looked upon as intellectual gods, to the point that in comparison to Scripture falls into obscurity. And they've taken fallacious man with his erroneous thinking and placed him as though he were the absolute. And that, of course, leads us to understand that when we get to our colleges, our schools, our young folk are going to face these things. And when your young teenager comes from college and says, "Dad, Socrates said," or Aristotle wrote, and he's using that to disqualify some statement in the Bible or something that you believe as a Christian, and you start realizing, well, something's wrong here. And you have to remind your teenager that these were pagan men, and their knowledge was derived, therefore, subject to error and change. And we find that historically, because as history devolves, you find other intellectuals correcting these men later on in history. The only available point of reference was two-dimensional. the external physical world and the internal mental world, what they call the nous, or the nous. The rise of Stoicism was a deterministic materialism, and the rise of Epicureanism was a human freedom. These are two extremes which were being battled even then. Is everything determined by the material world we live in? And if it is, what is the meaning of human freedom in all this? You see, they couldn't find a point of reference for it. And thus, civilization developed. The biblical worldview is revealed by God. The Bible tells us that God spoke to man. Here we are. Let's go to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, and we find a very important statement there. And, you know, it's amazing when we go to these passages, we take them for granted. But for someone who is going through the philosophical transition of life and thinking, this might strike them as strange. It says, now the Lord had said unto Abraham, wait a minute, the Lord has said unto Abraham, what does that mean? It means exactly this, that the God, the transcendent God, communicated into the world and focused on a human being. That the transcendent God in a seeming meaningless, cold, indifferent universe actually focused on the human race and said, I want to talk to you because you are important. You are significant. You matter. There is coherence in your existence. And that coherence is dependent on your relationship with me. You see, so now you have that communication coming from God. He's talking to mankind. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 8, you find God communicating to Moses. And even Moses in that area has an inferior complex, and he says, who am I, Lord? I can't even communicate properly. And God says, I chose you. I chose you. In Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, it says that Moses was the most humble man on earth. That's what God saw, you see. And it's important that the biblical worldview, we have to remember this. The biblical world is that God spoke to man. God revealed himself. We would have had no other way of determining a coherent worldview with ultimate reality if God had not communicated to the human race. And that's what we have being taught very clearly here in the Bible. And it's important that we see this. If you follow me to another example in Amos chapter 3, notice Amos and chapter 3 there, what he says. Amos 3, and there's a passage there in verse 7 that says, surely the Lord God will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants the prophets. He revealeth his secrets unto his servants the prophets. You see, revelation is a supernatural act. It is not an act of the mind. It is not an ecstatic experience. You know, we have people talking about being inspired. I was inspired to think this. I was inspired to write that out. That's not what the Bible inspiration is about. That's not what Bible revelation is about. It's about the God of the universe pulling the curtain back and saying, I'm here. And unless I speak, you can't know me. And that's what God is saying here, that he will speak to his prophets. The claims are those of external revelation. God contacted his creation. Both Old and New Testaments are derived supernaturally. They are not the product of human events. God revealed this book. You remove the Bible from the world, and the world will go back into darkness and collapse. God revealed himself. God utilized the space-time historical process to unfold his eternal scheme, a scheme of redemption. God came and told man what man couldn't figure out with his mind. Man tried to figure out existence. They wanted to find out the meaning of existence. They wanted to find out if there was anything coherent in it. And God says, well, there's more to it. God says, there is sin in this world. And you are in this state because of sin. According to Scripture, the historical unfolding of the human race had and has a divine purpose. God deposited in written form what his will is for his creation, and it is to be revered and obeyed. That is God's way of dealing with his creation. 2 Timothy 3:15 on says, from childhood you've known the Scriptures. And he says, all Scripture is given by divine inspiration. And that's important. It's important. God gave it. The whole human race must give account to the God of the Bible. That's what the Bible tells us. You see, these things, man without revelation could not in any way devolve philosophically. He could not determine that there was something wrong. He could not determine that there was something that needed to be done. He didn't understand that he was in a fallen state, a condition of sin, until God came along and revealed it to him. You see, even sin is something that God has revealed to the world. The world's condition is a revelation of God. The major world religions, as much as they tried to develop all these concepts, the primal religions had that said that nature is God, the pantheism. The Eastern religions, Hinduism, had polytheistic and mystic concepts. Buddhism, atheistic and meditative. And the Middle Eastern religion, Judaism, which was the Jehovistic theocracy, and Islam with Allah and his theocratic world. And in the Western religion, Christianity, that has God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Church, and the Bible. These are worldviews that exist to this day, and history's worldviews demonstrate a drift from reality instead of a going toward reality. When man fell, he drifted from God. He didn't drift to God. We have here, if you follow me in Psalms chapter 14 there, and the statement that's very clear by the psalmist about man without God, especially as we say when man becomes arrogant and man thinks that he can replace God. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There's none that doeth good. No, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge? Who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the name of the Lord? There were they in the great fear, for God is the generation of the righteous. Here you have the fool saying there is no God, because they reason away from God as the guider, the provider, and the judge of the universe. They don't believe in a personal, righteous God. Their concepts of God were really, as some of the later philosophers said, were projections of man himself. As the worldviews developed, You see the drift from the absolutes. You find the Catholics, the scholasticism in the medieval theology that said man can discover Christian truth by reason. They developed what was called the Neoplatonism, and which again they're reverting back to the philosophical, pagan philosophical groundwork to reason themselves into what they thought was truth. And they also said what reason cannot discover must be accepted by faith. By that, the conclusion is that faith is something separate and apart from reason, and therefore has no credentials on rationality. And we know that's not true. There's nothing more rational than faith. But that was the ideas that were prevailing in the medieval theology. Rationalism said that reality is knowable by the power of reason. Whatever is inconsistent with reason is not true. Deism said God created all things. God is so transcendent, but he's not immanent. God is not involved in the world's events. Agnosticism came along and said God is unknowable. God's existence cannot be proved or disproved. Then atheism came along and got brazen and said God does not exist. There is no God. There is no supernatural force in the universe. All gods are human projections. Materialism said there is no God, no supernatural. All matter is self-existent, mechanistic, determinate. And Darwinism said life is self-derived from simple to complex species. All things are in a state of struggle for survival. Only the fittest can survive. And Marxism, that borrowed from Darwinism and materialism, said God is the opiate of the weak, the hope of the hopeless. Government must be centralized and commodities must be communized. Government is God. And humanism said, and here's the thing, they borrowed from the oldest philosopher that began to focus on mankind as a complete intellectual, self-sufficient being. Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. And that is the very concept that the Humanist Manifesto begins with. It says, there is no God. Man is the measure of all things. There is no God to save us. We must save ourselves. Ourselves, say the Huxleys and their friends. Rational individual is the greatest value, the arbiter of our reality. They say there is no God, no Savior. Existentialism said that one is self-acquired. Self-expressed meaning is the greatest end for every individual. Truth is self-derived, self-selected reality. There is no external realm, no God. So every human being must live with a passion for now, because that's all there is. That is the idea of existentialism. Then you have the radical individualism as a result of existentialism that said the individual is the only source of consciousness. All things are consistent on personal experiences. Nothing is greater than self and self-fulfillment. You know, this is a sad situation because I have here also a note I took on what was going on in the early parts of this century, early 1900s. I took some notes on some theologians in America's seminaries in the early 1900s. Look at what one of them said. His name was Dr. Albert Coe. He said, more young people are exposed to social, individual radicalism by the churches than by all other agencies combined. You know, this is interesting because Dr. Edwin Burt, 1939, said, the religious experience of men and women become the decisive fact and ultimate court of appeal by which we test the validity of any theological concept, the concept of God along with everything else. It reminds me of the modern concept of salvation. The salvation concept that man receives Christ instead of submitting to him. It is a product of the radical humanism extent in this world where man sets the terms for a relationship with God and not the reverse. And it's amazing that this concept started being taught at the same time that existentialism started to take its effect. And as we read this, another person wrote and said, George Berman, he said, man creates whatever concepts and principles he may need in order to make himself master of the phenomena of his environment, to the same ends where gods are created. Man made gods to do for him what he could not do for himself. This is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology in the University of Chicago, 1909. The further away modern society removes itself from biblically based values, the nearer it merges to its original pagan practices. In spite of its technological, progressive, scientific civilization, it develops into modern neo-paganism. Old pagans with technological means by which to live out their hedonistic lifestyles. To a fundamental faith in God and the Bible as His revealed will is what we must move to. God and His Word constitute the only reliable, consistently productive point of reference for establishing absolute moral axioms from which we can reason to moral truths. You're not going to find a consistent, coherent system anywhere else. It's in the Bible. It's nowhere else. That's the reason the Bible has been attacked for years and years. It's the only book that's been analyzed to the very jot and tittle to see if there's something wrong with it. And it stood the test for 1,000 years. The Bible is the only point of reference we have. You see, the Bible gives us the reality. Hedonism said that the highest good in life is the absence of pain and complete self-gratification. Our society is inundated in technological experiments and processes to avoid pain and allow the greatest self-gratification possible. That's what you're hearing in the latest medical report. Because they're not talking about your soul or your spiritual well-being. They're trying to figure out ways to live longer so they can party longer. That's all it's about. The vicious cycle of worldviews in the pagan world was that of a recycle process. You know, they used to believe that the whole thing was a recycling. You can think of a circle, and it goes around. It's polytheism, idolatry, develops into pantheism. Then it goes into animism. Then it goes into materialism. Then it goes into agnosticism. And then it goes back into mysticism. And then right back into polytheism. That's the vicious circle of all human civilization. And are we not there today? Yes, sir. Check it out. Go look at it. God made a categorical statement when He created the heavens and the earth. You know, and I like to refer to this, I've titled this at this point, and this will be our closing point here. We have God's categorical act. It's called creation. Go with me to Genesis chapter 1, and let's look at that passage and notice here. Now, we want to keep in mind something here. First of all, Genesis, the book of Genesis was written so long ago, a telescope and a microscope weren't even in the imagination. That's how long ago it was written. No one even heard of such things. But in Genesis chapter 1, we have the categorical act of God. It says, look at the very first verse. It explains the whole universe for us. It says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the Hebrew is bara, bereshit, ha-Elohim, ha-Hashemayim, ha-Eretz. Ha-Hashemayim is plural for heavens. So you have a statement that there are more than one heavens being constructed here. Now, this is interesting because here you have the 5 categories that contrive the universe. You have space, you have time, you have force, you have matter, and you have physics. All in one simple package. In the beginning, time, God, force, created, activity, heavens, space, and the earth, now. Here's the category for the universe. You have it all in one biblical passage. Now, do you think Moses sat down and said, I'm going to get tricky here? No, he didn't. How did he know? Because the information came from outside. It came from the one who did it. That's the only way he could have known. And that's not all. You have the entire system of the universe being revealed here. And verses 2 to 10, you find a mineral system being created. In verses 11 and 13, you have the vegetable system created. In verses 14 to 19, you have the astral system created. In verses 20 to 31, you have the animal system created. And in verses 26 and 27, you have the spirit system created. No wonder Psalms 19:1 says, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. God is a God of systems, coherent systems. They work together in harmony for a positive, productive reality. He is a God of order. He is a God of purpose. He provides the physical material system, and he provides also, he has the system of moral order and the system of spiritual order. And you see that the strangest thing, you can't get to the spiritual until you're born again. And you see the world is losing out. And when our kids go to the universities, the world says, here's where it's at. This is it. Well, see, our kids can say, I've got something you don't. You see, you don't have what I have. What's that? I have a spiritual life. I traffic in a different universe, and it's eternal. And they say, what's that? What do you mean? I don't get that. You see? Because, well, you need to try it. And you can't get in there without knowing the author. And that's God, the Holy Creator. This evening, we must understand that when we look at these things, we're looking at reality. This is not fantasy. This is not theoretical thinking. This is not ethics. This is reality as it really is. God, the pagan world had a circular meaning of reality. They believed in reincarnation. They believed in soul travel. They taught these kind of things ad nauseum. They believed in levels of rebirth. You're going to have rebirth, but you get a vicious cycle with meaningless existence. It means nothing. But in the Bible, the Judeo-Christian reality is linear with divine supervision. And it begins somewhere, and it's going somewhere. And God shows you how to get there. And that's what's wonderful about it. And we have the, how we view history determines our role in it. And how we view the world determines our relationship to it. Perspective is crucial to destiny. The way you think determines your destiny. That's why the battle of worldviews is a battle for the mind. And we need to understand that. One last illustration, and I'm going to let this lesson be yours. And is this the greatest question? It's what's all about? What's it all about? What's the question all about? We have the world. In Genesis 1:31, God says He created it. God says it's perfect. He said He saw His creation, and behold, it was very good. You have a superlative statement in the Hebrew. It means it can't get any better physically. But then man decided to let an external being come in and through him, and that being brought in sin with it. And with sin came that nice little package, dirty death. They said, well, what does that mean? Well, when my college colleague would tell me, well, if there's a God, why does He allow murder? Why does He allow theft? Why does He allow... what about earthquakes and volcanoes? What about all this? Sin. Sin registers death. All these catastrophes, illnesses, diseases, unfortunate dying, and early premature deaths, all this simply spell extensions of death. And all the consequences of sin. You have a coherent answer, and it provides a dependable worldview. And that's what we have when God did this. I want us to lead by reading a passage. There's a passage that I find just wonderful, and I think we need to know this just to show us the goodness of God. Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. And this is where God not only provides a coherent worldview for us, but He even gives us something beyond our comprehension. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 1 says, therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through Jesus Christ. That sounds good. Drop down to verse 8. But God commendeth His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Jesus died for us. I don't get that, but I love it. You see, until Christianity, the world didn't know that there was actually a God that was a person. And they didn't know that a God could love. And that's what we have in our God. He so loved us that He sent His only begotten Son. And He gives us everything. We have the coherent worldview, and He provides a coherent guide so we can have coherent lives. And we can die satisfied because it's only an exit from here to the better. I want to thank you for your attention. Colossians chapter 2, and beginning in verse 1, we find these words penned by the apostle. For I would that you knew what great conflict I have for you, and for them at Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love, and unto all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the acknowledgement of the mystery of God, and of the Father, and of Christ, in whom are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And I say this, lest any man should beguile you with enticing words. Verse 8 says, beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. We're going to speak of the clash of worldviews today, the actual collision of worldviews, and we're taking our thesis from a historical, philosophical viewpoint. I didn't decide to go much into the scientific area of discussing these things because the volumes on this issue are thousands and thousands, and you can find them anywhere. What I want to do is, as we began last night, is take us to a course of thought, give a broad brush of all that's gone on, so we can have at least some kind of concept of the things that have brought us to where we are historically and as Christians in this world. I'd like to also give you some recommended reading before we continue. There are some real good books out there that you can read, and I'll let you look at this if you want after the lesson. One of the books is called Escape from Reason by Francis Schaeffer, where he treats a lot about a lot of these things that we're talking about. He does a real fine job. It's a small book. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to read through it. And then there's another one by Francis Schaeffer, and I think it's a culmination of all his works and experience. It's called How Then Shall We Live? And the other book that's really excellent that also gives us a historical overview of atheism and secularism is called Does God Exist by Hans Kunk. And then there's one written by the Englishman Os Guinness, which is called The Dust of Death. That's a real good symposium of the movements of modernism for us to understand what's going on. And then, of course, there's an older book written, but it's very cogent, a very good book to read. It's called The Abolition of Man, written by C.S. Lewis. And then finally, there's one that's written in a more modern style, but very, very relative. It's called The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. He does an excellent job in detailing a lot of the flow of events and the current situation for our schools particularly. So he does a real good job, and I would suggest these. Another thing is, anytime that you really want to get an overview, I brought this. These are very low cost. This is called Christianity, Cults, and Religions. It's a fold-out. It gives you a comparison of all the predominant ideologies and worldviews that are existing today, and you can kind of go through them. And these are good things to have, especially if you want to understand where the minds of people are today. They're all going to categorize somewhere in here as far as their concepts of God and religion and spirituality are concerned. The historian Cornelius Tacitus, who lived around 55 to 117 AD, was a Roman historian and also a governor. And he wrote a history of the Caesars. And in his statements, he says this. He says, "The principal office of history I take to be this: to prevent virtuous actions from being forgotten, and the evil words and deeds should fear an infamous reputation with posterity." And that's a very good statement for us to have in mind, because it demonstrates the moral aspects of history, especially in times where, beginning in the 17th century up through the 19th century, histories were beginning to be compiled in a supposed abstract sense. The encyclopedias came along, and by the way, the people who generated the concept of encyclopedic knowledge was a group of elites coming out of France, and the president of that group was none other than the famous Voltaire. But the concept they had in having encyclopedias was simply to contrive a method, a mechanism by which to control and generate knowledge. That is, the only knowledge available to the human race would be that which first would go through their heads, and therefore no one would be suspect as to whether that knowledge was accurate or not, whether it had a particular worldview or not. So whenever you go to an encyclopedia to do a research paper, just remember it's not absolute knowledge. You may be receiving someone's viewpoint or worldview in that very encyclopedia. And you'll particularly get a sense of this when you read the religious items in these encyclopedias. So we have to be careful. There's nothing more rewarding and more useful than going out and learning history yourself. You know, go out and read the biographies, read the histories, and C.S. Lewis himself said, if you want to get to the truth on any matter, read its history. And he had a very serious point on that. The writer Ravi Zacharias, who does a lot of lecturing, relates where he goes through the world lecturing, and he says that he stayed for a whole week in one place, one university lecturing, and one of the young people there, about the third day, stopped him and said, you know, Mr. Zachariah, I really can't get your drift. He says, you keep quoting history, you keep quoting writers, literaries, and all sorts. He says, you know, that really is kind of nauseating. Don't you have anything new to say? He said, I mean, all this nostalgia, it's really wearing me down. And Mr. Zacharias said, young man, he says, the only thing worse than nostalgia is amnesia. So he made a very cogent point there. So let's talk a bit about these things. Let's begin where we want to begin. As far as the abolition of faith is what we call the drift, where the rise of humanism came into existence and faith started to decline. You have this happening very early in history. And the reason we introduced with the Colossian text was to remember one thing, that if the most potent effect that any humanly derived philosophy has is usually a tendency toward self-deception, and we need to understand that. And a lot of times, someone said that a lot of the philosophers were self-deceived deceivers. So it's very important for us to understand that when we're listening to philosophers speak. Now, the cultural divide, as far as that's concerned, you remember the model we gave yesterday of the worldview, the circles that we had, the connections. We had these connected by lines. Well, today we're going to relate them by a line of division that we have here. There's two lines. It's kind of hard to see, but it's called the equation of coherence, or grace over nature, as it's called which was believed by the medieval and Renaissance theologians, who had to combat with the coming of the new ideologies and the rationalistic philosophies that started taking over in those days. We had what was called the descendants from cogency and coherence into despair. What we call the line of despair is a point in time where there was a major shift in human thinking, when human thinking no longer relied on the transcendence of God. They began to define reality simply using human reason as the reference point from which determine all, even faith, even the supernatural, was beginning to be determined by human reason alone. And that became the absolute. That became the point of reference. We had, from the years 1835 to 1890, began a very strong drift as far as the modern Western culture is concerned. It began early with the rise of the non-absolutes. Again, the encyclopedias, such as Voltaire, began all that. And then from the rationalism, rose the age of reason, as we call it. And from the age of reason, we had the reactionary, which was the age of existentialism. And existentialism as a philosophy began, by the way, in a religious arena. And it's amazing how because it broke away from the definite point of reference, it turned into an absolutely egocentric, secular type of philosophy. Now, but we saw that it was a philosophical transition that came. There were some great thinkers through history by which humanism came to rise, and we're going to name a few. Augustine, for example, who wrote that famous book called The City of God. He showed the battle between two different spheres of existence, the city of God versus the city of man, or the city of Satan or evil. He did a tremendous defense in this book because he goes through just about every philosophical concept, and he demonstrates either the cogency or incogency of those concepts. Now, he did a wonderful job, but then after him came Thomas Aquinas, who is the one who actually began this formula here, the grace. You had the line of division on top, you have grace, and under the line you have nature, which was the concept that God, the term grace represented God. It represented God as the creator, transcendent, immanent, heaven, heavenly things, unity, truth, eternity, infinity, and nature, of course, creation, the contingent, created, existing universe. It had the earth and the earthly things, the three-dimensional space-time material universe, what nature and earth and man do, and all types of diversities within that, and it was the finite temporal things dependent upon the eternal. The reference point was still the eternal. As history moved on, you had men come up, you had a philosophical descent or the ideological decline. Rene Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650, is the man who came up with the great famous statement, cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. And of course, John Locke came after him and spoke of the tabula rasa, or he's the one that actually started bending, he and Bert Kelly, toward the empiricism, toward the sense approval of things, no longer reasoning in anything other than human reasoning. David Hume, the rationalist, came along and started attacking faith as something more of a deception than anything else, something unreliable to focus on. Voltaire, of course, came around at that point, 1694 to 1778. Notice the time where the autonomous started to come into existence, the idea of independence throughout the world, and with no point of reference, actually, for most, it spelled chaos and disorder. But Voltaire is the man that came out at this time and vehemently opposed Christianity, opposed God. He pronounced the demise of the New Testament within 50 years. He said it took 12 men to write the New Testament. It will take one man to undo it. Of course, referring to Voltaire. Well, within 50 years, Voltaire was dead and Bibles were being printed from his printing press. But God has a very interesting sense of humor. And then, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau came in with the intellect behind the French Revolution. And from this point, you get the main transition, which is Immanuel Kant. He's the man who wrote a critique of reason, or the reasonable, in another book, the reasonableness of faith. He was referring to the fact that man can reason faith into existence without any special revelation. And that threw in the monkey and the machinery, because it allowed men to no longer go to the scriptures or the Bible as the definite point of reference for discussing any issue, including theological or religious issues. And Immanuel Kant began this, and it's strange. because of that, Immanuel Kant, there are things that are unknowable, he says, the things that we would call the things of the higher existence, as he called it, the world of the noumenal. He says everything else functions in the world of the phenomenal or the physical. But the noumenal is that beyond reason, and that which we cannot touch. And the closest we can come through it is through our reasoning, he says. And that's what he called the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself. Something just, you can't grasp it mentally, and he says, that's where God is. So he was saying you can't know God. He was breaking that connection between grace and nature. There was a defragmentation of creation from the Creator. And that's what you saw happening with Immanuel Kant. George Friedrich Hegel came around and he said, well, I'm going to fix Kant's theories, and I'm going to present another method of reasoning, which is a dialectic. Dialectic simply means contradictions, which means you've got a thesis, you say, well, this is blue, then you've got an antithesis that says, well, it may be purple. So you mix them both and you get a synthesis, as he calls it, and you have a mixture of both, and it should solve them both. So it became the dialectic, as they called it, a mixture of the thesis and the antithesis. The solution is the synthesis. As you can see this, we want to conceive what this means in the long run. In the long run, it spells relativism. You see? Things don't have to contradict. You can compromise them. But this was happening back in 1812 with George Hegel. And then after George Hegel comes Soren Kierkegaard, 1813, 1855. Kierkegaard comes in with individual dialectics. Now he's saying, well, how do I know that reality is reality? I see things this way, but I think of them this way. How do I reconcile this? Well, compromise them and formulate your own concept of reality. You see, that's what was called the leap of faith. We don't have any reasonable, rational reason to believe in an absolute God. Therefore, in order to avoid despair, let's just jump a leap of faith and just say he does exist. You see? And he started this tremendous movement that led to the doubt of God, to the disconnection between grace and nature, disconnection between the Creator and His creation. Alienation started happening. And right at this point, guess who comes up? Yes, Charles Darwin. And Darwin really lays a death blow to an already dubious faith with his Origin of Species. And Darwin came along, and T.H. Huxley picked up right on it and said, you know, Darwin's right, and Darwin's got a point, and since we know that Kierkegaard, Kant, and all the rest taught us that faith is unreasonable, and if it's reasonable, it's only an act of dialectics, then I think, he said, I believe that what Darwin is saying is probably the truth of the matter. It is all chaos after all.